Too many alerts and not enough action? It's time to get SaltStack. SaltStack is an intelligent IT automation platform that detects security issues in critical business systems and then actually fixes them. With SaltStack, security and IT teams work together to define custom security policies with certified checks for CIS, DISA-STIGs, and more. You can scan systems for millions of compliance checks in minutes. Remediate compliance and vulnerability issues with powerful automation, all in a single platform. Visit securityweekly.com/SaltStack to learn more. Make sure your team is prepared to fight off the latest cybersecurity threat. IT Pro TV is the resource to keep you and your IT team skills up to date. You can stream IT Pro TV courses live and on demand, so there's no need to send staff to offsite training. Team subscriptions include Pro Portal, so managers have full control over your team's training schedule. Go to itpro.tv/ASW and use the code ASW30 to try it free for 7 days and receive 30% off your monthly membership. SysDig is the first cloud-native visibility and security platform that eliminates the need for standalone tools like container security and monitoring. Using SysDig's unique data approach, enterprises can solve a variety of visibility and security issues at massive enterprise scale for multi- and hybrid cloud environments. SysDig will enable your organization to scan and block vulnerable images and enforce best practices pre-production, block threats, enforce compliance, and monitor application performance, proactively alert on incidents, reduce MTTR with forensics, and capture detailed audit records, all from a single unified platform. Accelerate your transition to containers and then have confidence in your ongoing operations using SysDig. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/SysDig.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. We need your help in a survey we are running for research purposes for an upcoming webcast. Please visit securityweekly.com/5 stages of automation maturity to submit your response on our, well-named, 5 stages of automation maturity survey. We will share the results in a webcast in November. This year's Compass Cybersecurity Symposium is being held at Twin River Casino in Lincoln, Rhode Island on September 25th, just 15 minutes outside of Providence and 2 days from now. The venue has plenty of free and easy parking. Speakers include social engineering expert Chris Hadnagy and Security Weekly podcast founder Paul Asadorian. Use the discount code SW2019 to save $20 on registration. So, Matt, John, last week we went pretty heavy on the bugs and breaches section of the podcast. And today I just pulled out one a little bit because we were talking about online payments and improvements being made in the EU that hopefully will trickle over here into the US. But this one was about a long-running campaign against essentially local government payment portals. And it's a team that's been going active since, I think, October 2017. And really, the two things I wanted to highlight is here's a long-running campaign. The attack code has been changing. The attackers have been tracking changes in the software they're running. In other words, they're basically following a standard DevOps process of feedback loops and iteration. But the other thing, too, is that according to the write-up from FireEye, they're essentially parsing log files to pull out card detail information. So it's one of those things that, for as much as we extol logging, because logging helps your DevOps team, it helps with debugging applications, but it can also become a liability. So to me, those were just two of the things that stood out when I was reading through this particular article.
So while we've had continuous integration, continuous delivery, we now have continuous compromise.
Continuous compromise, exactly. So,
yeah, a couple of things that were interesting out of this one, right, is it's Oracle Web Server, Oracle Web Logic that's got some CVEs in it that it was part of the exploit to gain access to parts of this. But on the logging front, it's interesting, right, in that we've seen other attacks go after logs too, primarily for credentials. But here they're going after credit card information because they're being put into the log files. And so I think there's some lessons learned here about what you do and what you don't log, or what you should and shouldn't log as part of your log files. Because if you can gain access to them, pulling out the credit card data or even credentials, which is attacks we've traditionally seen, if they're in the log files, that's probably not what you really wanted. It's more about what errors and other things are going on. So I think there's some logging lessons learned out of this one as well.
Yeah, it's absolutely a tough one because obviously, HTTP traffic, it's coming in, and you need to have those post bodies essentially, I'm going to guess here, or JSON blobs if it's hitting a CRUD style API. But just those raw HTTP requests are going to have all the PANs, the card numbers, the CVV, as well as what you were mentioning too, credentials. So making sure that when those actually get saved off for longer term storage, that there is a method of redaction, and ideally, possibly even rather than a opt out of fields to redact, possibly even considering an engineering approach to opt in and saying we're going to redact everything, but we want to actually get access to the raw values for these particular fields. And maybe it is email address, maybe it's something else, but hopefully it is less of the sensitive information that leads to direct financial compromise if, when it's been taken and reused elsewhere.
Yep.
This is sort of an interesting target. If you think about it, So usually, it's we're used to seeing people go after the big guys, or that's what gets into the media. The I don't know, the Googles or the Facebooks or that type of thing, like a really large attack. But local governments are the ones that have probably one of the smaller budgets, except for maybe a legal office, when it comes to actually staying on top of IT. So it's sort of interesting there from that point of view of like, and this is a good target for them to go after. And as they start going into things like doing more stuff online, either payments of something simple like a parking payment or parking ticket payments or citations or building fees. So as they start dealing with more and more money, that's a pretty interesting place for malicious users to go after.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of attacks going after the government, municipalities, et cetera, more from a ransomware perspective, right? We saw a number of them down in Florida and in Baltimore. Then we saw some stuff in Massachusetts and Texas and different types of results. But those have been primarily ransomware attacks. Mm-hmm. Here, what you have is a very targeted attack going after kind of the same basic community, but through this click-to-gov application, actually scraping credit card data and a lot of other stuff, and using that as the monetary means versus a ransomware attack, which is interesting.
And clearly, it was financially viable if they're going through iterating on their attacks over a period of 2 years. So it's not like they're just trying to pick on that for the sake of a small feature. They're picking on it because to take the old cliche, that's where some money is. I think that also gives us a good lead into another article. So speaking of insecure coding, so we have GitHub, who is the curator of Git repos and the Git command line, for which no one can ever quite remember what the right flags are when you try to merge and roll back items, has now acquired a company that no one is necessarily ever sure how it's pronounced. But GitHub acquired Simul, which is going to bring some interesting, I think very positive, more security to the GitHub's ecosystem. GitHub is kind of grabbing everything it can around securing code and securing that CI/CD, not the the continuous compromise, process.
This one's interesting. Go ahead, Matt. Okay, fine. Probably about 18 to 24 months ago, we had several startups which were trying to get into this space of, I think what Simul is playing with, the ability to, really just index and mine that code base or code bases. So there was a few startups out there that were playing in that space that couldn't quite figure out, at least from my radar, how do you really, what do you do with it? I think we were talking recently about, it's been shown that actually pointing a machine learning robot at GitHub doesn't actually give you strong signals for mature code. But yeah, GitHub's been doing a lot of really interesting things in the security space recently, so I'm not complaining.
No, I mean, this goes back to the problem of the software supply chain, right? We are integrating a lot of open source components across the board. To your point, there are open source tools out there. But the ability to integrate this into GitHub is interesting because if you can catch these vulnerabilities early as part of using Git, then I think we have an opportunity to make sure we're bringing down patched or the right versions of libraries and binaries into our code base. Hopefully easier flag potential CVEs that have to be addressed. I think this is good for the software supply chain long term. I'd like to see more of this stuff kind of happen over time, but this is a really interesting integration point for developers to get a little better visibility into security of the code they're bringing down.
Yeah, I think, a little bit of a callback to just our previous segment. We were joking a bit of the, coding via Stack Overflow. But, even when people go to resources like Stack Overflow, they're not necessarily, cutting and pasting ideal programming patterns. In a lot of cases, they can actually demonstrably be implementing very poor or insecure programming patterns from, if they're just Googling or looking for other things of how do they implement some particular algorithm. So having this capability, I think, just to echo what you're saying, Matt, sounds really good. And it's definitely of a piece for what GitHub has been doing to say, here's where all your code sits. And actually, here's where everyone's code sits. So not only can we help this one repo, we can also help all these other repos just from that supply chain factor. But now they actually do have a lot of rich information to be able to say, here is a LGTM.com. Here's a query that's been run against a whole bunch of open source tools. Now we're going to throw that into Dependabot potentially and start even just automatically opening pull requests to fix vulnerabilities. Automatically suggest vulnerabilities for the repo's owners. Or vulnerability fixes. I guess we shouldn't be suggesting vulnerabilities unless.
Right.
Different podcast.
Different podcast. Yeah. So once we go into generating our own bounty programs, then we'll do that. But speaking of software problems, we'll take this to talk about CWE released their top 25 most dangerous software errors. Mostly, not to take away from the effort here, but the list is both sort of a snooze fest in terms of lack of surprise about what's on it. It was, buffer overflow, cross-site scripting, lack of input validation, and then information disclosure were the top 4. So probably pretty non-controversial there. What was different in this year round is that I think the last version came out in 2011. So it's been a while since CWE has talked about, top lists and gotten into the top list business. But what they did was actually, rather than just do a pure survey and ask people what do they think about there, they did a survey of software. And based on that, this is what they saw. So
it was more of a research project than it was a survey result looking at the NVD and what was out there. And so here's the point, right? It's the same stuff. How do we fix this, right? I mean, it's not like we have constantly new challenges popping up on this list. It's the same stuff that we all know. But what's surprising is we're not really making many dents in resolving some of this. At some point, you'd like to see these numbers go down and something else surface up that's new that we can start to attack or address, right? But we're not there yet. I mean, we're still fighting the same bugs year in and year out for the last 8 years. I don't know that bodes well for us in the industry.
No, it doesn't. And especially, I mean, both those top two, smashing the stack, the famous Frack article, and cross-site scripting goes back, it used to be called HTML injection, even before, pre-2000. So it's not even that these are 8 years old. They're much more than that. So yeah, I think it's a little bit underwhelming in the sense of what the security community industry has done in terms of getting rid of those classes of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I'm actually covering an article on Business Security Weekly later today and I didn't put it in this show, but it was an interesting article. It's basically like, look, companies are frustrated. They're spending more money on security, but they're not getting the results. And so there is a lack of confidence in general in what's going on in security, because even though we're throwing more money at the problem, we're not necessarily seeing the results of that investment. And that's a scary thought for us in this industry.
That's a good point. And it ties in too. So the BSIMM10 came out as well. And that's another way that often organizations will try to align and say, well, here's how we're going to invest in security. We're going to go through a whole bunch of activities that are related to the SDL, and we're going to mature them. And we're going to also possibly kind of cross our fingers that it has an impact, or we're also going to try to that more nebulous aspect of how do we demonstrate that investment paid off rather than just showing maturity. This time around, BSIMM, I think it kind of is an acknowledgement to the emergence of DevOps. I think it, as DevOps is a benefit, as well as to the great emergence of cloud-based technologies and the cloud-based infrastructure deploying applications. They have called out new activities in the BSIMM, basically the governance of the SDLC, as well as doing monitoring, basically what we were talking about last week, Matt. How do you monitor where all of your apps are? How do you do a software-based asset inventory? And then, of course, there's also, they pulled in infrastructure as well. And we've talked about infrastructure as code and what does that mean? So we start to see some of these adjusting to what developers are doing, what engineering practices are. So hopefully this also will give us a rubric to demonstrate how to mature those, in the sense that with that maturity comes an increased amount of security.
Yeah, but here's the challenge, right? Is here we are, well down this concept of DevSecOps, and we're now just starting to identify some of these additions, which means we're behind as usual. And now we're going to have to figure out how do we mature these new things as the DevOps train just continues to bolt out of the station, right? So, if these aren't eye-opening for people, you should be concerned, because we've known this for a while, but we're just now trying to adjust our models to account for this stuff. I mean, that's a little late, I think. So again, this is where I'm a little concerned with just the disconnect between security and what's going on in development environments. And how do we eventually get ahead of this thing, or at least catch up to it? Because right now we're just so far behind.
Well, and that's interesting, because if we, kind of on that theme of are we behind, you called out another article about storage and DevOps. And that was interesting because there was a line here too that DevOps has implications for storage, or storage can benefit from that approach, but you can't just purchase your way into a DevOps solution for your storage needs. It's actually that idea of culture and people and process in order to do that. And I think that's kind of saying, here's yet another area where we don't talk about as much, or the industry is a little bit lagging behind, perhaps.
Yeah, and the reason I brought this article in was because there's been a lot of conversations about storage in DevOps and containers and kind of the ecosystem we're starting to face now. John, we used to have this conversation, when we were doing the stuff at Layered Insight, right? About the persistence of storage and where do you put it, right? Do you spin up your own database in a Docker container? Well, that it's no longer immutable if that's where your database is, right? And so I thought this article was a little interesting because all the storage vendors, similar to all the security vendors, are going through the same issue of how am I relevant in a DevOps environment and the new infrastructures that we're moving to? Because look, if I'm a commodity storage solution, how do I make myself relevant in the world of RDS and S3 and all the other storage solutions in the cloud? And how do I make myself relevant to developers to integrate all the storage that I might have in the data center to stay relevant as I move this stuff around? And what's that integration look like? And to your point, Mike, a little bit here is that it's the same challenge security is going through, is how do we integrate not only security, but how do we integrate storage, and how do we integrate some of these other concepts into the whole CI/CD pipeline? And it means we have to integrate with developer tools, even at the storage layer. And so, yeah, they've got some of these really interesting kind of late to the table discussions as well.
It's sort of interesting. Excuse me. I think one of the things I've seen over the last year with storage, we've had these storage startups for probably about 3-5 years now doing Flash and stuff like that, and I've always sort of wondered why. And in the last year, it's really sort of focused down. I mean, I'm not saying that you don't need, fast storage in some cases, but what I'm seeing is a lot of organizations that the storage, I'll say, part of the organization, we talk here on this podcast about excuse me, Siri. We talk on this podcast about like getting the security people is early into that developer discussions as possible as part of architecture. I'm seeing similar happen on the storage side where maybe you've already dropped $1 million on your Hitachi arrays or whatever have you, and now that part of your organization, I don't want to quite call it operations, but storage ops, they're sort of scrambling to keep up, and how they're doing that is how we've done security in the past. And as you were just saying, Matt, in the previous topic, they're throwing money at it. And I think you need to, take a step back if it's either containerized or, do you need that type of performance? Do you need to have all the bells and whistles of a multi-million-dollar storage system? So I think a lot of these questions need to be asked with confidence and discussed in an open manner. And it's the same thing with security, right? It's do we need to send the whole org to a month-long security training class, or can you do sort of baby steps to actually make incremental improvements and looking at BSIMM, actually looking at, or even what I think it's Carnegie Mellon has their maturity model also, sort of moving in steps up through that and not just sort of, oh my God, we've got a deadline next week. How much money can we spend on this to make it faster or more secure?
Yeah. No, I agree. And it is baby steps, but it's having the conversations with the development teams.
Yeah.
If we're going to sit back and I just expect us to be part of the discussion without us actually reaching out to have that discussion, I think we're way misinformed. And same for storage in this particular case, right? But I see the analogy of what's happening in security with the storage folks as well, and everybody's trying to figure out how to survive. Because if I'm a developer, why would I want to deal with like integration to a SAN or NAS connected storage when I can just like quickly through an IAC configuration have RDS or S3 up and running in cloud storage? I don't have to worry about connecting to an array or any other crazy stuff. I don't have to worry about persistence and maybe all the other stuff that you have to deal with in the old legacy storage stuff. And now people are like, oh, where's storage fit into this overall architecture? Well, too late. Dev's already moved on.
I think that's also a good way to call out, as we've been talking about a little bit of the history of, InfoSec and history of engineering. There's another article I brought up about it's 15 years since Microsoft started its the SDL, the Security Development Lifecycle. And this article had some good insights in just terms of a look back, saying, what had to change? How did we have to adapt? And I think three of the things are pretty unsurprising again, but just kind of reinforce what we've been talking about, meaning that there's a lot of programming languages out there to deal with, but also the speed of development, the speed of releasing code has definitely influenced the way we approach and do security training and the way security teams work with engineers, because one of the other line or two of the other quotes from here are that developers want to do the right thing. It's not necessarily that these tropes that they're lazy or that they're ignorant. They may not know about security, so there should be that aspect of education. And that's why we have an SDL that is where the execution comes from the engineering team. They're writing the code, but needs to be advised by a security team. But that's kind of the people focus. But there is one great line at the end that I think to keep in mind is that training is good, but tools are better because people forget and code doesn't. So that's where when we have something like GitHub and Simul, GitHub, and its Dependabot and its other types of known vulnerabilities in dependencies. Those are great ways to bring code to help people, to remind them and saying, yeah, supply chain is important. Your dependency graph is going to be huge and complex. Here's the tool to help you do that.
Yep. Which kind of leads into this last article, which I added, which is, software eats the world and software development jobs are double the growth rate of the rest of the U.S. economy. And we've been talking about this for a long time, right? In that digital transformation is driving software development jobs, and the global economy. And when you look into some of these numbers, software industry grew at twice the pace of overall U.S. employment. Between 2016 and 2018, the industry grew by 7.3%, which is more than double of 3% growth for the rest. Software companies now indirectly support over $14.4 million jobs. This is a growing industry. And when you think about the impact of that growing software industry, the growing developers, the growing speed at which DevOps processes are going to continue to go, that should signal a lot of people that we've got to get on top of the security issues around this industry soon, because pretty soon it's going to outpace all the stuff we're trying to do in security, which puts us even further behind from a security perspective.
Yeah, and the impact is even the very first article we were talking about with the click to gov. The exposure there wasn't actually. I think that was in the low millions. It wasn't like hundreds of millions of people were affected by that. Not to mean that doesn't mean it's not important, but I think the other part of this scale of software eats the world is that there's also so many more people that are online. Data is online. Privacy implications of this, of so many people being interconnected, that the impact of these software vulnerabilities, even if we can joke around and say, sure, cross-site scripting buffer overflows are 20 years old, impact was far, far different. There's a big difference between SQL Slammer worm, pulling down, a few hundred thousands, databases with a few hundred thousands of records at the time, versus now an open S3 bucket or Elasticsearch that's revealing hundreds of millions of bank account info or things like that.
Yep, the scale just gets scarier.
It'd be interesting to see what those growth numbers look like internationally, because my gut sense is internationally probably growing faster than it is in the U.S. We're constantly trying to, and I'm not saying we do a good job, but still we're constantly trying to find talent in the U.S. And many companies end up going overseas for that. So I'd be interested to see. Does it break 10% globally?
It'd be interesting because there are, and I think it's going to vary by country, John, right?
Yeah.
We've seen a lot of, it's Singapore, Hong Kong, India, where they're trying to do a lot of electronic stuff, moving stuff, the government agency stuff into software platforms. My guess is those growth rates probably a little higher. Australia's done a lot on software development and containerization and growing down there. So I think it will vary by country, but I could see some countries down there potentially outpacing that job growth in their specific countries because they're more aggressive in some respects than the U.S. with some of these projects, especially on the government services side and moving that stuff into software and digital.
And the reason I mentioned that is to drive home the point we're just talking about even further still, that we really need to try and get on top of some of these things as quick as we can.
Yeah,
or
without a doubt,
also be able to educate those people as they enter this market to think about security properly in the first place.
Absolutely, and I think that's where we can. Hopefully, they'll go and submit some PRs to Nicholas's open source project for all of those that are writing in Python, and of course, listen to Application Security Weekly for other ways of educating developers and learning about software security. I think there was one last thing just to mention is that I did want to highlight that Nicholas had mentioned that he was a listener to Application Security Weekly, had this idea, and wanted to reach out to us. We also had another listener, Jay Durga, who also had some ideas and reached out to us as a listener and wanted to share some of his work on the OWASP ASVS. So for all of those out there listening, if you have ideas, please reach out and give us feedback about what we've been presenting, feedback, or give us ideas on what you'd like to share yourself, or if you know someone, please introduce them to us, because we'd love to have more people from the community join the podcast.
Definitely.
And with that, and I want to say thank you again to John. Thank you again to Matt for joining this Monday.
Always a pleasure.
And I want to thank everyone else for joining us as well. We are going to see you next week on Application Security Weekly.